Hello, Lancers. It's Lancer Media, and we're here today with the National Book Award-winning co-author of the March Trilogy and former digital director, policy advisor, and campaign communications director to the late Congressman, civil rights activist, and our school's namesake, John R. Lewis. Mr. Aydin, it's a pleasure and an honor to be here with you today. Thank you so much for sitting down with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
To start, tell me a little bit about you as a high school student, you as a college student. How did you get into politics?
I think the reason I wanted to be in politics was because I was raised by a single mother. And I grew up in the 80s and the 90s in the South seeing the way she was treated. Yeah. And, I can remember having these conversations with my mother about, why is it this way? And then asking, and then telling her, I want to be different. I want to be a different kind of man. Mm-hmm. And so in high school, I think I was more into comics than I was into politics. Yeah. I would go every Wednesday with one of my best friends down to the comic book shop, and we would pick up, whatever was out that week. And it was really when I went to college that it became more obvious that politics could be a career, right? Yeah. I was raised by a single mother. My father left when I was very young. Politics was not something that we got involved in, right? That was for rich people.
Right.
And it wasn't until I went to college and could really get involved in a grassroots way. I mean, I think my first boss who hired me, knowing my activism in college, he said I was quite the rabble-rouser. And I loved it. I mean, it was, I got involved in student government. We held protests and sit-ins, and we made the school change their policy on library hours and all this sort of stuff. And it was this realization that organizing could work, and that you can actually change things. And I think back, I had known of John Lewis growing up, but I didn't know him personally. But I remember we held a sit-in because we were really tired of, they would close the library hours early, and all the scholarship kids, I was a scholarship kid, our hours would get cut. We didn't have access to the library at night. And so we were like, all right, this has got to stop. And so we held sit-ins. And the president was like, what do you want? Do you want to get arrested? I was like, no, I want the library to stay open. And he was like, fine. And you're like, thank you. Oh, wow, this is great. It worked. And it was just so eye-opening to me, and then that's how I got into government, because I also got involved in advocacy at the state legislature, and he was the president pro tem of the state senate, later the lieutenant governor, took a liking to me, and I kept, bothering him. I kept lobbying him. I kept being an advocate. And eventually he hired me, and I started working for him even before I graduated, and then I formally started full-time the day after I graduated from college. I mean, I graduated on Sunday, I started working on Monday. It was so quick. My mother and grandmother, who were in town for my graduation, showed up to my first day of work unbeknownst to me. I think in some ways just to see if I really did have a job. But it was then stick their head in, and so that's really where it started for me. That very much my family, and then my own sense of, I guess what the congressman would say would be righteous indignation. Yeah,
I love that, and I remember John Lewis saying something about we need more leaders with empathy. We need more leaders that are connected to the people, and so just that personal story from you is showing that you're connected to the people. What people are experiencing, and that you can advocate for that is so amazing. How did you work with John Lewis? What did the day-to-day look like when you started working with John Lewis?
Well, it started, I started in his office answering his mail. So I really started at the bottom. And you write those letters, and you bring them to him to sign, and I'd sit there while he'd sign them. And I guess he liked the way I was able to write in his voice. I think that's something that, when you're growing up and you're on scholarship, you don't have the same luxuries. You learn to code switch, right? You're always trying to fit into whatever room you're in so that they don't kick you out of it, basically, right? Yeah. And I think in some ways that was the same sort of ability I brought to that task, right? Again, all right, I'm going to learn this voice now. And I learned his voice, and started writing those letters. So then he asked me to be his press secretary on his first re-election campaign in, I don't know, 10, 15 years. And so I went down to Atlanta, and then on that campaign, we kind of became like two peas in a pod. Like I would drive him around, we would go to the events, I would write the speeches or the ads or whatever. And to me, it was also this education, because even though I'd grown up in Atlanta, there were so many stories about what SNCC had done, what the young people had done in the movement, that nobody had told me before. And so sitting there, you go to these events, he goes to a school, he talks to kids, or he goes to, the Rotary Club or the Chamber of Commerce or whatever, and he's telling these stories. I guess the story I'd always heard was more of the story of gods and kings, right? It was LBJ versus Martin Luther King. It was Malcolm versus Martin. It was those sort of stories. And I'd never heard the stories about the sit-in movement and how it spread. I'd never heard the story about the original 13 Freedom Riders and how they led to, they carried on the Freedom Rides and really were the ones who made it successful. And then the connection between integrating the buses through the Freedom Rides and how that made the March on Washington possible, right? We think of it as like, oh, they had a march and Dr. King gave his speech and everything was great. But there was never that connective tissue between how you went from an individual act of civil disobedience to building a movement and all the different parts of that the young people were essential to. And so it was on that campaign that really just opened my eyes, and that's where I really think I fell in love with the history. And also was frustrated because here I was still growing up in Atlanta, and yet nobody had told me these stories. And shown me the power that I could have had, or that in some ways I guess I did have when I was at Rabble Rouser just a few years before in college, right? And so then as we got older, it was more of a, for a long, long time, he had my desk positioned so that if he opened his door, he could see me. And I was the only person he could see in the back room. So that he would just stick his head out, he'd look over, Andrew, and then you go back, and sometimes, it was very serious stuff. Like I remember I was the one who had to break the news to him that the Supreme Court had struck down a portion of the Voting Rights Act in the Shelby County decision, because I had it before the news channels did. And other times he was just wanting to goof around. Like, he was very playful. And so we would go back and he would want to gossip or ask what I'd been hearing or something like that. And then, once the books really started to be in process, that was a whole nother thing, because then we would stay up late talking on the phone. So then after we go through all of that, the books come out, right? And I'm still, by that point, I'm senior staff, we're working on things like net neutrality and other technology issues, but also this is when Good Trouble really came about, because we introduced that as a hashtag. That was part of one of the things that I did in the office. And now it's so ubiquitous, it's almost strange in some ways. But then we're on the road together, right? The books come out, all of a sudden they're wanting us to speak. You've got these major universities using it as their first year reading book. I remember the first one we had was Michigan State, and Magic Johnson's mom came, you're like, what have we done, right? Like, this is a comic book, this is getting a little out of hand. And then from there it just got even wilder. And so then we spend 7 years touring the country, and that's an even more intense and personal thing, because I'm having to follow him on stage every night. So it's like John Lewis gets up, does his John Lewis thing, right? And everybody's like, that guy's amazing. Who is this guy following him with his silly comic book, at that point, no, I should take it back. They were taking the comic book really seriously. And so I would always start off my speech, and I'd just be like, how do you follow that? Like, what do I do? And I think in some ways just acknowledging almost the absurdity of the position I'd found myself in at 30 years of age, really actually helped me connect with a lot of the students in particular, because the questions would always be like, so how do I do what you did? Yes. And I'm like, because there isn't a roadmap. You look at some of the other leaders about my age that you see, and they come from very wealthy families. Particularly, some of the recent elected officials from Georgia, like their parents really helped smooth over a lot of their shortcomings. And I never had any of that. I just had John Lewis as my advocate, and somebody who I worked together really well with, because we were the same kind of weird. We would sneak out of the office and go to this antique auction house, because he loved to look at the art. and we'd be like rummaging around in these bins and whatever. And so I think for these kids, it's like, how do you, for all of us, like how do you, as a congressman, say, how do you make a way out of no way?
Yeah.
And I think the thing that I tell them over and over again is that you have to just listen to your gut. You have to follow things that you believe in, because if I listened to everybody's reaction to March in the early days, it never would have happened. They thought it was something a congressman shouldn't be doing. They thought it was ridiculous. But I believed in it, and I risked everything to make it happen. And more than anything, it helped John Lewis. And I think that's something we also have to keep in mind, is that we can't do it by ourselves, and we can't underestimate the value of learning from people who came before us.
Thank you so much for sharing your story with us. I think your story and John Lewis's story are so inspiring because it shows that roadmap for students who haven't come from a lot, so that they can make a change if they just get involved and do something they believe in. So thank you so much.
No, thank you. I appreciate you.
I appreciate you.